All right, so today we are on the last day, and we're going to be talking about the RESTful API, and I'm going to do a demo of two quick tools that I've made in Python, and I'll be happy to share that code with you guys if you'd like to pick it apart and reverse engineer some of what I did. Most of it is rather simple. I don't have a background in software development. All my background is network engineering. I went through Cisco Academy and just took one object-oriented design class in college. So it's obviously pretty simple because I've been able to teach it to myself and figure it out.
That's good.
All right. So we're going to go over what a RESTful API is, how we use it. I want to talk a little bit about JSON formatting because that's what our API uses exclusively. And then I'll jump into some tools and examples of what you can do and how you can use this. And then I'll go into our own tool that we've made to use the API called tbconfig, and then follow it up by giving you a brief introduction to some of my Python scripts and a little demo on how they work. So what I want everyone to understand by the end of this is what exactly a RESTful API is and what's possible with our API. Obviously, this can't be a totally inclusive training on everything, but if you understand what's possible, then it's a great place to start in either building your tools or reaching out to us for help about these tools. We need to understand how the JSON file structure actually works. And the tbconfig is an incredibly useful tool. So I want you guys to understand that you can use that and you can find the commands on how to use that on our wiki. And then I'll begin to show the pretty nearly limitless possibilities once you bring in an external intelligence like Python. So REST stands for representational state transfer. And basically it's an architecture that's designed for machine-to-machine communication over HTTP or HTTPS. We know web pages, we've been using them for a long time, and they're really useful for humans because they give us pretty pictures and things like that, but they're rather difficult to deal with from another machine's point of view. So the API lets us use all that infrastructure, use the web server and use all that, but it sets it up in an environment that's much more cohesive towards a machine talking to a machine instead of a human talking to a machine. We allow independent control of independent components. We were talking before about how our SNMP does not support write, but anything and everything you'd want to do through SNMP write functions, you'll be able to do through our API in an environment that's a little more tailored towards that. In general, REST APIs are going to use JSON or XML for communication, but just to let you guys know, we're using JSON exclusively. So the RESTful API pretty much just replaces a human in all the interaction with the web portal. From the TMG's point of view, whether it's a human logging onto the web page or whether it's a script logging on through the API, there's really not that much of a difference to it. It's going to hit the web server in the same way. It's going to talk about the same resources. You'll see that everything I'm doing or communicating with is using a URL and HTTP link, just like you guys are used to. And then the TMG is able to filter that and change the configuration database, no matter whether it's a sysadmin or whether it's a script that the sysadmin has made. There are quite a few methods in API, but we're only utilizing 4 of them. I'm supposed to be focused on this, not question. That we're only using 4 of them. I'll explain what each of them mean. They're all pretty much self-explanatory, except the difference between post and put. Get is to get information, delete is to delete a resource, and post is to create a new resource, while put is to modify one. So the main difference, if you hit Control-Shift-I on Chrome or Firefox, it's going to pull up your debug console on your web page, and you're going to see pretty much everything that the API is doing happening between your browser and our web server already. But obviously with a GUI, it needs to be intuitive, and you need graphical displays for the humans absorb information quickly, whereas with an API, you can just print out long lists of data and the machine can absorb that information just quick enough. So here we go. To make sure I said that right earlier, I have this slide. Post is to create a new resource, while put is to update the parameters in an existing resource. You can see here, I've got a little bit of a color scheme going on. So what's green are what we call collections. So this HTTP:// your IP address, your port / configurations. Just like a folder or a directory when you're browsing a web server, it operates the exact same way. So / configurations will be where we keep all of our configs. So if I just run this git command on configurations, it's going to spit out to me a JSON dictionary of every configuration on my server or on my system. Not the ones that are active, not the one that I'm reading, but just like when we went into our web GUI here and we go to configurations, and I'll log in again. We go to our configurations and we see this list. That's exactly what would be outputted to the API if I just did a query on those. So then after that / I've got something in red showing you that it's a resource. That's a creatable resource that can have different names. And this is just a sample name, 2022 config. It'll change based on all of your actual settings. In our environment, it's been September_training so far. So then once you create that resource, there are parameters within the resource, and that this can get recursive. Our total configuration file with everything in it and every default parameter is about 6,000 lines of JSON. So it's quite significant. Now, if you're creating something through the API, a lot of the default ones, it's going to assume already. So you don't really need to have copies of all that or memorize all of that. But if you want that golden config we were talking about earlier, where you can just change some things, it's a good idea to make sure all your defaults are the same. So what I have in blue here are specific parameters, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but these exist in a key and a value type environment. So I have the name, and then after that colon, I have the value of the name. So what's in blue will not change. These resources will always be called name, they'll always be called NAP, and they'll always be called remapped NAP. If you remember before, I mentioned that a NAP in our system is an ingress or an egress point, and you can see I'm in routes. So basically, I've got a call route being made here from toPublic that comes in on A4 private and then leaves through A5 public. These red things, again, are resources. These are NAPs you would create with their own custom name. So once I've created this brand new route called toPublic, if I wanted to change something, I would use a different method. Instead of post, I would use put. And if I wanted to delete everything, pretty self-explanatory, I would just delete that. So the idea here is that you can centralize your configuration and your management. A lot of the Git commands are going to give you status on our device as well. So you can get things a little more intuitively than SNMP v2. Be honest, I haven't used SNMP v3 very much, so I don't know how much better it is. But this would be not. That's unfortunate. So this would be a really efficient way for you to have one device that's constantly polling everything really quick, and you can get all the information that's on our status pane or our dashboard. You can get it in a machine readable format, so you can do whatever you want with it. So there's quite a few reasons to use APIs. If you want to automate the configuration, that's not such a big deal with our devices because how big our devices are. They're not CPEs. There's not many people deploying thousands of them. But still, if you're just doing one-off and the configurations are the same and you only get your hands on a new one every few months, automating the configuration can simplify large numbers, but also reduce the chance of human error. And that's a big benefit of using the APIs. There's less things to forget, less things to make mistakes or typos on. You'll see in one of my tools where you pretty much have to configure everything you'd have to configure anyway, but now it just asks you in a yes or no type question, whether you're using ITU or ANSI, and then it applies that everywhere, things like that. So it greatly reduces the chance of human error. And in some environments, rapid changes might be needed. The only one I can really think in our environment would be a non-H248 config, where you want to rapidly change routes. Maybe you want your customer to be able to buy the right to dial internationally, and then you need to approve that route for him to go through. But in the H248 environment, the Metaswitch is going to handle all of that anyway, so it's not so pertinent. And it can speed up activation and deployment time. And then, of course, finally, what I've already touched on is that integration with an EMS or any central management service. It can pull a lot of the stats and things like that. It can get you the logs and the diagnostics. So in short, it's designed for machine-to-machine communication, and you're going to use the API to empower you by using machines to do the simple stuff. So the API is going to communicate over HTTP or HTTPS, and the configuration in the services, when Luc was showing you how to change that, that's going to apply to your API and to your web GUI at the same time. So if you change all your web GUIs to HTTPS, remember that all your API tools need to be using HTTPS as well. Same goes for the IP and the port. It's going to be the port of the web interface, not the port of the SSH. And when you need a username and password to access the API, it's going to be web users. So you can create a web user just for your API so that your logs are nice. And you can see, oh, that was the API, or my colleague who does the automated testing on our system calls everything robot. So I know if robot blank did something, it's one of his scripts that is in there.
And it can be limited to some of the modules, right? Of the configuration. Doesn't have to allow configuration of everything.
Absolutely. So just like Luc was talking about how you can make user groups with certain permissions, those permissions will apply to the API. If you're having an API that can dynamically change routes and that's all you ever expect it to do, you don't need to give it write access to your TDM lines. You don't need to give it write access to your other settings. When you're setting this up, as you get into how it communicates, whatever tool you're using for the API, you need to tell it the content type, because like I said, APIs can use XML. Some of them use plain text, but not really that much anymore. So just remember, for us, it's always going to be an application, and it's always going to be in JSON. And as I mentioned, these are the 4 verbs that we support. And just like a web URL is often directory/specific file or script you're running, this is going to be collection/resource in much the same format that you're all used to already. Then nested under that, you could have the optional parameters that you could put in to the URL directly. You could actually use this using your debug tools on Firefox or Chrome. It's a bit silly, but you could. And they would be, a lot of the times you might see when you search on like a shopping website, you'll see a hashtag or a pound, and then you'll see maybe Q equals or $Q equals, and that's a PHP script that's activating something. So in much the same way, we can do name equals 2022 after a question mark, and it applies those configurations to our URL. So I want to pull up one of our JSON files real quick. Made and deleted them so many times today in my testing. Let me find one and delete. And while I'm finding that, there we go. Trying to remember the hotkeys to close everything at once in Notepad++. So here we can see that I've got all these things, and then they're followed by the colon. So remember, I told you that these exist in a key value system. It's what's called a hash or a dictionary, depending on the program language that you're using. I've been learning Python, so I call them dictionaries, but I think JSON calls them hashes. So one thing I want to keep in mind is that this is actually a dictionary of dictionaries, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, but the value of this key of web profile is another JSON file, essentially. So it's a JSON dictionary nested inside of a JSON dictionary. And as you get into the more complicated things, it becomes a dictionary nested in a dictionary nested in a dictionary. And it's one of the reasons why a full config here can get to nearly 6,000 lines, but it's also what allows this simple flat file to carry all of our configurations, all of our configuration in a completely reproducible method. You're probably familiar with CSVs where the comma separates the values. Here we've got a couple different things. We've got this bracket, which is specifying that it's a brand new collection. And then the colon, which is going to separate a key from a value. Quotations are just used to encapsulate strings. You'll see that true and false are not strings, they're booleans. So they actually have a value inside of them. You don't need to put those in quotes. And if you do put it in quotes, it'll fail. You can see here that this is the name of my config. A little bit later, I'll be grabbing the config that we've made, and you'll see that this will say September training. So this is a rather old one. I'm just going to go ahead and close that. We're going to come back to that and look at it a little bit more later. So that JSON file is just a file that's saved and stored, and you can upload that whole configuration to the unit at once through the API, and it'll just have a brand new configuration that either the API could activate, or you could go into the WMI, see your new configuration and validate it and activate it. The API does do validation of the config before it applies them, but I have found in some really specific cases that the validation of the WMI, the human readable WMI, is a little bit more vigorous and might catch configuration mistakes a little bit better. Whereas the API is still going to catch invalid configurations, but it won't save you from forgetting as many things. So make sure that JSON file is correct and full. And I would say if you're doing a lot of these, the best way to do it would be to begin your configuration through the WMI, follow our training, set it up, then export that configuration as your gold config that you base everything else off of. So you also could do this in segments. You could take one of those resources or one of the sub resources and just begin to modify that and changes there. As I mentioned, this is pretty much the same thing. So that JSON file can get completely pushed to our RESTful implementation, which then gets deciphered into our web server and then stored into our toolbag database. At the end of the day, it's going to be exactly the same as if you configured it on the WMI. Activating the config, we'll talk about this in just a second of some different collections, but you'll see I'm no longer under the collection of configurations that I was talking about before. Instead, I'm under this collection systems, and my resource is system one, which if you have a standalone unit is by default always going to be its name.
Well, it's all the systems, Joshua, are system
even
one.
A TMG 7800?
Yeah. It's always system one. This was historical reason that there was a name there. It's always system one.
Oh, okay. All right. So it'll always be system one, apparently. And then there's a parameter under system one called target configuration. And as I mentioned, the API does do a validation. And that's why it has this concept of target configuration. You can't directly change the active configuration. There's no method to do that. There's no way. What you can do is tell the system that you want a new configuration. It'll run through its validation, and if the validation passes, it will begin to activate it. And just to recap, that's the collection, that's the resource, and then here's my parameter, and then my value. In this case, my value is another resource. Happens a couple of times, like when we bond an ISDN to a TDM port, things like that. And so just a reminder, that's how that separation, I think I've been pretty thorough, so it's not needed. So here's some of our top level collections in our API. And this config is actually, or sorry, this screenshot is directly taken from our TB config tool, which I'll show you in a minute. The configurations I talked about, it's where your configurations are stored. And then inside that resource of the configuration, you'll have more collections, more resources, more parameters. Systems is where you go see our always system one, and you can do some specific things like change the package, roll back firmware, update to new firmware, change the target configuration. There's a couple other things, but nothing else comes to mind right now. I think you can do loopbacks on lines through systems. And user groups and users, as we mentioned, they are outside of the configuration so that you don't lock yourself out by changing to a new configuration, which maybe only has root, or even worse, has something you don't know. So the user groups and the users are their own collections, excuse me. And as a reminder, these are not SSH users. These are only WMI users, which is synonymous with the API. So then status, it might become it might be self-explanatory, but you can't do a put or a post on the status. You can't tell the unit what kind of or what the state of its line is, but you can run the get verb on it all the time, and you can run TDM lines, you can run IP lines, you can run naps. Pretty much everything you see on our dashboard that we were watching go red to green. I didn't check the SAS server, but now that I'm saying it, I want to make sure I can get SAS information from the API. Just writing that down real quick. And all of that from our dashboard or our status page, you can get printed out to you directly to the output of your console, however you're connected, or generally, if you don't put an extra modifier, it'll dump these in a JSON file. So pretty much all the information plus some that you can get with SNMP, you can get with the API. The API has a few things that SNMP doesn't. And as we mentioned earlier in the training, we support SNMP, but in my feeling, the API is more efficient. You have more control about the polling. You get the correct information in live time, and you'll never see a discrepancy between what your engineer on the NOC logging into the web page is and what your system monitoring it behind the scene is. I think the API is the more elegant solution for live monitoring.
Yeah, well, the main difference with SNMP is that SNMP is a standard, and if you already have your system being able to poll SNMP and get traps and stuff like that. So this part of it may already be integrated, right? And then you only need to add the new TelcoBridges MIBs for SNMP. With this tool, of course, you could go further than that.
That's exactly right. If you're setting something up from scratch and you've never worked with an API or any scripting behind an EMS that uses APIs, SNMP is going to be a breeze to find an open source one online and set up. But if you've got a team that manages your EMS and they're already using APIs for other things, which I would say is the norm in most companies now, especially at the telco level, I think it's a great way to do it. I don't have this saved of the status, so I'm going to come back to looking at the recursive status yet on the dump JSONs. We're not using many files because we're mostly talking about an H248, but let's say you were doing routing on your TMG and you wanted to set up specific digit maps or white and black lists or things like that. Those are stored in CSVs on our system, and the API can also upload those. I can see a situation where maybe you would upload announcements in a Metaswitch environment, but since you would only be doing that once on setup, I think SFTP would probably be a more useful way to get them up there, but you could do it either way. So in short, anything that's done from our WMI by a human to the machine can be done through our API, machine to machine. And before I jump into the next section, I'm going to take a look at some of these questions. Do you know if there are any plans for Metaswitch to leverage the API to do config changes via their EMS? I don't think that's been talked about yet. I don't know enough about their EMS to know if that's mostly managed by them or managed by their customers, to be honest.
Yeah, so no, we did talk about it initially, and we pushed it aside for now. Not saying it's not gonna come back later, but it's, you know, it's H248 on a media gateway is pretty static configuration, right? So so it's not that. Let's say, of course, if you want to change the names and you need also to change it on a media gateway, but it's let's say minimum amount of work to do that. So we pushed it aside for now. Maybe it's gonna come back.
And David asks, if the API is used to make config changes or rapid changes, how does that relate to the meta? In other words, what would you have to be done to make the meta aware of your changes, or am I totally out to lunch? So I would say that in an H248 configuration, the rapid changes is not much of a needed thing because there's going to be H248 communication between your media gateway and your media gateway controller. If you change routes, you're going to do it on your Metaswitch, and the TMG is not going to care because he's just going to be told what to do by the MGC anyway. So I would say in the H248 environment, it's probably most useful for deployment. It's most useful to make sure that all your configurations are exactly the same and that every time you add a new TMG to your Metaswitch, the configuration is perfect.
Yeah. So one of the so you mentioned that one of the advantage here is that especially if you have some advanced configuration. So let's say you want to change your SDP profile. So meaning you want to have specific codecs into the system. If you want to have, I don't know, a specific M2 UA thing there, right? So that's when it will be important to push the correct configuration to the system. With the RESTful API, you have all your advanced parameters set correctly. When you configure it manually, well, you need to open the advanced parameter box and choose your options, right? So yes, you can have a manual commissioning document, and we are actually creating one to help configure the system. But if you forget to open it and put an advanced parameter, you made a mistake, right? So the RESTful API would prevent such a thing. And okay, so one more thing here. It says, how is the meta aware of the change? Well, it's not aware, right? So these are two separate systems right now, and you need to make sure in the MGC it's configured the same way as on the device. So, for example, that M2 UA link as we use the 55 and 56 interface ID. It has to be also on the media gateway, two different places to look for sure.
And so I think the bottom line in an H248 configuration is the real value of the API is not the speed of the changes, but the reducing the chance of human error.
Okay.
Let me make that font a bit brighter. I'll make sure everyone can see that.
Is that bragging you got a 64 Mustang, or is that saying that's what you want?
More about what I want. I'm on two wheels here in Vietnam.
That's right.
So here's an example of a hash or a dictionary, and using an example that we can all understand. Everyone who has a car has the brand of the car, has a model of the car, and has a year of the car. Even if you made it yourself, you made it in a year and it's your own model and your own brand, but everyone has one. So that's how a dictionary works. This brand, model, year doesn't change. It's the same for every car. But then what brand, what model, what year is constantly changes. You'll see that my Ford and Mustang are in quotes where my 1964 isn't. So things like Boolean, true or false, are not going to be in quotes, and numbers, straight numbers, are not going to be in quotes. Anything that is an integer, double, or float will not be in quotes. So you can see here that this comma means I'm about to specify a new key. The colon means I've specified a key and I'm about to specify a value. The braces means I have a dictionary, and all that is in there is in the same dictionary. So just to keep in mind, in Python, true does not equal true. In Python, the Boolean of true must have a capital T. Our API doesn't care, though. So if you're using Python to develop, that might get you in trouble. It got me in trouble once or twice. All strings need quotes, as I've mentioned a few times, but integers do not. And as we were looking at that simple one about the car, here's one where it's more complicated, because in date time services, which is the key, the value is another dictionary. And in that dictionary, there's a new key of configuration. And the value of that key is another dictionary. And inside that dictionary, there's a key of NTP parameters. And the value of that, you get my point. All of these are their own dictionaries. Everything that starts with this. So you will see this is a list. So in this case, the value of the key servers is a list of strings, not a dictionary. None of these have keys. And so you can see how our configuration with all of our advanced parameters, all the things that you can microcontrol on the TDM lines or the timers on SIP or the timers even on SS7 or SIGTRAN, all of these need to be stored somewhere. And so that's why we have dictionaries within dictionaries within dictionaries. It makes referencing them from a machine's point of view very easy, but it can make the config file a little overwhelming the first time that you're looking at it. So we can see here that these are at the same level. So inside configuration, I have one key where the value is a whole other dictionary. And then I have another key that's setting and the value is just NTP. And then I have a third key where the value of time zone, where the value is America/Montreal. And so that's the main point. Just like a list can contain a list or a list of another list, just like you could make 4 shopping lists and put them in your pocket and keep them together. And now you have a list of lists. A dictionary can contain dictionaries. And that's all of our JSON config file is. It's a dictionary of dictionaries. And once you understand that, setting this stuff up, it's really easy. I already mentioned this manually, but the brace starts the new dictionary. So taking a pretty simple one, our web profiles. Remember in the first day when we made that configuration, I said that you can uncheck things you don't need so that you don't see them on the status pages grayed out and you don't even see them on the configuration. That's the very first thing. And that's the web profiles. And then we talked about the different application settings and things like that, where we have gateway, we have our log trace, all of these and all that information is right there. There is not a single setting that exists on the WMI that isn't in this somewhere. So if I close it all, you begin to see a really similar structure to what's on the left side of our WMI page, only the order isn't the same. Our WMI is in a specific order to help the humans configure it a little bit easier. This is in alphabetical order because that's how machines do things. So one thing I want to point out here, you see that we have host IP interfaces, but then we have hardware units inside of that. And you can see here, I also have IP interfaces under my hardware units. So just like Luc and I were mentioning before about how the RTP is going to go to that telco board inside of that, we see this nested structure in our WMI, but even more obviously, we see it in our JSON file. My H248 IP interface is going to be on my host, whereas all of my VoIP, my RTP, my SIGTRAN, they're all going to be on that IP interface inside my hardware unit. So now I'm going to talk about the TV config tool briefly and explain how this works, because it's really a great way before you begin working on a tool to learn the API. And it's also incredibly useful if you have no intention to ever develop a tool. So this is a tool we made that runs on every one of our systems that ships, that basically just gives you a CLI way to interface with the API while you're SSH'd in. So I can't remember if it was Conrad or Darren, but someone asked in the second or third day if you can configure our units through the CLI. It would take a very long time, but yes, you could use this tool, but you could rather quickly go in and modify one resource with this tool, and that's not difficult at all.
Yeah, and you can push the whole configuration with TV config, right? So you can do it with this tool.
So there's an interactive dynamic display that I have down here, which is probably what I'll be talking about the most. And that's nice because it shows you the whole structure and you can kind of explore. And that's what I mean, that it's a helpful tool to learn our API. The command line, the one-liners are things like Luc was talking about. With this tool, you can just push a whole config at once. And shell, you could, in theory, go in and modify one resource at a time if you remembered the rather long command as you get to more specific resources, but you can do that. So the most simple thing to do is to get into this, and that's the dynamic one that I was talking about, where you're presented with a list and you can use the arrow keys to go select one. And to do that, on a default system, you can just type in tbconfig. But once you change the root username and password for the WMI, not the SSH, you will need to use -u username -p password. Remember, these are the WMI. I've answered quite a few support cases where they were just using their own password, and I've made the mistake myself a time or two. So here on the right, you can see that that list that I was showing earlier on the slide. So this is what it looks like, and I'm about to do it live for you so you can see as well. But this is what it looks like. You can just use the arrow keys. You can go into status. You can go into configurations. And then when you go all the way down so that you're in the parameters of a resource, you can hit enter and you can type something new and change it and hit C to commit the changes. It's rather easy. Down at the bottom, you see log hidden, press H to show. That's really useful if you plan to build a tool, because what that log will do is give you the full URL of every resource you interact with. So if you're like, oh, what's the right URL to post /put /get delete? You can find it just by navigating through this, hitting enter, going, I'm there, and then hit H and see it. So like we saw that before, that's exactly what it looks like. So here I am kind of drilled down. I'm inside of a configuration. I'm now in a very specific NAP. So you can see here, these are green because they are resources. Like that would be the name of my configuration. And then there's the collection that's gray. That NAPS is a collection, same on every device. And then here I can see those HTTP status messages, which is useful. I can see that get where it's going to. And obviously the IP address is going to be a local loopback because I'm local on the device. But I could take the tbconfig of one device and connect to a remote one if I desired to. I'm not sure what the use case of that would be, but maybe you don't have access to the CLI of the other device and you need to use it, but the WMI is on the public. So then you could use this to go through it. Then I see that configurations collection that's the same every time. My custom named configuration. So that would be September training in ours. And then telephony services, or TCAP stacks, or where I'm at actually here would be the most recent one. And that's the configuration, the collection of NAPs. And then I'm just getting a status of all my NAPs. And here we see that question mark indicating a modifier, just like it does on PHP. So if I go into one of my TDM line interfaces, here I'm drilled into an OC3. I can see these individual things. I could change the name there if I wanted to, or I would never change the type of an OC3. I would make a new line interface, but there I could. And now, oh, I'm not there yet. So here's one of those configs apart from the, commands apart from the dynamic config that's very useful. This is one I use often, and I ask my customers to use it often. This will put out your entire config into standard output. It's not going to be in a JSON. It's actually going to be a little more readable of that, of nested under each other. There's one more modifier you can put on this that I'm going to show you in a minute that will store it locally in a JSON file, which I probably use more often. But sometimes I've been on a customer config and I know exactly the setting that I'm looking at. And so I would just run this command with a Linux grep, pipe grep after it. And it gives me exactly the resource that I was looking for. Or maybe I kind of know what the setting I need to change is, or I can't remember where it is. I could do the same thing. If it's like a specific timer and I know the name of the timer, I could output this and then search the name of the timer and it would just stick it out to me. This -U and P I've already explained. And this -R means recursive. So when I grab this Metaswitch config, don't just give me the information about the config, give me everything inside the config, which is useful for the command that I'm trying to do. Here we go. I've only added one thing to this command. I put a space in here and then given a file name .json. I could put a path if I wanted to. Here it's just going to save to my local directory. This is going to give nothing to standard output. It's not going to give you any response. Your prompt's just going to go away while it compiles, and then it'll come back. But then you'll see in your current working directory, I would have this file called metaswitch_config.json. And that would store the whole config in there, everything, because once again, I'm using this -R. You can query a specific resource if some reason, like maybe you want to just clone your H248 or maybe your M2UA settings because it's not working on another one. You could output all the way into that specific resource if need be and save that into a JSON file that you could upload later. Just the most useful is the whole config in my experience, because then you have Notepad++ or whatever your text editing tool is, and you can pull the information you need out of it. So this would be the reverse. This -C is specifying that I'm uploading a resource there. And so I'm going into this collection. That would be the name. This would need to be in my current working directory, or else I would need /root, whatever, /, and then the name that it's going to have inside of our configuration. So it's actually the name of that resource, which is a parameter in some cases, but not on configurations. And then username and password. And remember, if you're running on root, you don't need the username and password. You guys are going to get this slide. So this is more so that you have it as a resource than it is for us to really go over everything here. But here are a couple of very useful ones that I'm using constantly. And they're all on our wiki as well. If you search tbconfig on our wiki, you'll get a page that has all of this. All right, now I want to pull that up. So if I do tbconfig here, I'm not going to get in, and I'm just going to see that root at 127.0.0.0.1 and our 123.5.8, which is our default port number. And we'll see that I'm getting this 401 unauthorized. That's because I do not have a user on my system that says root. So I'll need to do what I talked about before. It's not root, sorry. And there is my username and password. And now you can see that this is expanded. So I can go into my status page here, and it's pretty much all those top level things that you see directly. Ooh, that's not the one. Here's my H248 status. I can see that my number of in-service fixed terminations is 1,314. And since the out of service is 0, I guess that's all the ones that I've configured. I can go into my configurations, and then here's that list of configurations that you saw on my web GUI every time I click that configuration page. And here is the one that we've been modifying. So inside of this, we have everything we've changed. We didn't change any web users. So everything we've changed on our setup will be in this. I'm trying to think if that's wrong. Yep, no, I think that's right. In my hardware units, remember I'm existing on a 1+1. So I see my primary and secondary. You can see that these are named exactly the way that we named them when we set it up. Is there anything specific you think I should show while I'm in here, Luke? I think the idea is getting across.
No, we're good. We're good.
$56 elements in there. And I can drill in and see them all specifically if I wanted to. And that 0xFFFFE, those are my time slots. Inside systems, I only have system 1 as an option, and apparently that's all the option will ever be. You can see here that I have this thing that says active configuration, but if I tried to change it, it would just give me an error. It says that it doesn't work. I would need to change my target configuration if I wanted to use a new one. And just like all of our applications, the gateway, the toolpack, the toolpack sysmanager, if you hit question mark, it's going to give you some more information. So here you can see how I know how to actually save my changes. I'm going to commit them, or I can cancel them if I think I've made a new mistake. If I need to recursively copy an element, which is something you can't always do in the WMI. So that can be useful. A lot of things you can copy, but not everything. So that can be useful in some cases. And all that's visible just by hitting the question mark. You really don't need any training or education to use this tool. You just need to know the first command, and then you can start to explore. It's rather self-explanatory and rather easy. So there are some other tools, like if you're looking for a way to play around with it, I would recommend you download a tool called Postman. Some information's there, and on our wiki, I'm not going to talk about it now, but on our wiki, we've got basically the get yourself set up and started, and it's a tool to make APIs human readable, essentially. It's like a non-proprietary TB config that runs on Windows. Python, however, is how I've been mostly interacting with it. And I'm going to show you a couple different scripts that I've made. And we're going to use one of the scripts that I've made, because if you remember, we started all of our interface names at 00 when they should have been 01, and that kind of gets confusing. So I have a script that'll go in and find them all and change them up one for us, and we'll use that. I've had a rather easy time using online tutorials to teach me how to use Python. Like I said, I'm not a software developer. So if that's your background, you might look at my code and say it lacks any sort of elegance and grace, but it is functional. So I did that. And I'm sure that there's a lot of the functions that I've made that you'll be able to take out and implement or see exactly how it's done. And then you can use it with a stronger background to make even better tools. So I think someone with real experience in Python could put together a functioning tool in about 4 hours. It took me a lot longer than that because I had to learn Python first, and then I had to learn the API, and then I had to put them together. But the only thing you need to learn is our API. It is not going to be difficult for you at all. One of the core tenets of Python is that simple is better than complicated. And with our API, that's kind of proven to be true over and over. I'm testing here from Vietnam, so ignore the fact that this is a local loopback address. It's going through an SSH tunnel that transports this 54511 to 12358. And here would be an example of me getting all the configurations on a gateway. So if I wanted to see that whole list that I saw just through my tbconfig tool here, it just takes these 8 lines. Once you import this request library into Python, it has an understanding of all the methods of the API already. Like I said, we're only using 4, post, put, get, and delete, but it understands all of those. You can see right here, all I'm doing is requests.get. Then where's my URL, which you can see I have a default URL right there. And then I need to put this configurations on the end. And obviously it's going to ask me how I'm going to log in, which I need to specify my username and password. That creds variable stands for credentials. And then headers, it's that thing that I mentioned earlier where you need to say that we are going to be speaking in application/JSON format. If you know anything about Python, you'll know that anything and everything literally is a variable, and you can't even do some things without making a variable. So you can see that of my 7 lines of used code here, pretty much everyone's just making a variable and then telling it to do that thing. So what it's going to do here in this CFG response is it's going to run this get, and it's going to look for the JSON in what the API responds to it. And then it's going to store that in a dictionary of config responses. So if the next thing I did was print CFG response, I would just get a printed list of all those configurations, just as simple as that. this one more command is telling me to only keep the JSON and to remove like the status code and the headers of the HTTP communication. Here's a pretty simple example of me activating a configuration. So you can see here, I'm actually starting to use dictionaries inside of my variables. This is a dictionary where I have target configuration and I'm telling it to activate a new one, just like I talked about. Once I do a put there, or you can see here, I'm doing request.put, but previously it was request.get. It's going to apply that parameter to the API right away. And then I'm telling it to put the response here in that JSON message. And it's just going to tell me that the configuration is validating and successful. Also from this module requests, I've imported the HTTP basic authentication that knows how to handle the username and password and just skips a lot of communication steps for me. It's a submodule of requests. Someone who knows more about Python could answer why I need to do it twice. I'm not entirely sure. So here is a bit of code from the tool where I completely from scratch create a whole STM1 and H248 configuration. And you can see here that inside this conf, I'm calling it the payload, and it was a poor name because there actually are payload types in our setting, but my mentality when I named it that was it's the payload that I need to deliver to API. So try not to get confused there. And you can see here that Python has no problem with the concept of dictionaries within dictionaries. And so I'm able to store all these resources exactly the way that JSON does, exactly the way that our entire configuration was. So I could start this out with sample configuration equals, and then all 6,000 lines of our text, and then just go in and put certain variables here. So anything you see here that's blue instead of orange means I'm breaking away from strings and I'm now using another variable. So here you see TB serial. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to name this configuration auto STM1 serial number of the unit, and it's going to get that variable elsewhere. Also, you can see here, this configuration was automatically generated on, and then plus creation date, right? So now in the description, the notes of my configuration, I'm going to use this variable. And this allows you to create really powerful things because you're going to have 99% of these things that are not going to change system to system. They're going to be the same every single way. So you'll just hard code them as strings. And then the things that do change, like the name of your config, the time that it was, your DPCs, your OPCs, your termination IDs, all that stuff can just be variables.
Joshua, we will be running out of time soon.
Okay.
So did you want to show something live?
I did. Stronger example of what I just made. I think I can skip through all of this. This is just some very complicated math logic where I'm counting in weird loops so that I can make all 84 interfaces. And now I'm going to explain the two apps that I'm going to use live. So the first one I made was the very first one that I did. And I want to keep it the way that it is because it's useful for demonstration. This actually connects to our gateway in 3 ways. First thing it does is it connects to the API and asks what the active configuration is. Then it SSHs to the unit. This didn't need to be done, but I didn't know how to do it through the API yet. It generates the JSON config through tbconfig like I just showed you. It actually SSHs to the unit, runs that tbconfig command. Then it connects to SFTP and downloads that config to your computer. Then I'm going to run a quick regex link. And like I said, all those line interface names, I'm about to do it. We're going to change them all from tag 00 to tag 01. And if it's tag 15, it's going to go from tag 15 to 16. Then it'll reconnect through SFTP, upload it, go back into tbconfig and run the command to import it. And then through the API, actually, it's going to activate it again. So this is a really good example of all the different ways it's unnecessarily convoluted. And if I made it now, it was the first thing I ever designed. If I made it now, it would be a lot cleaner. But I kind of like the example because it shows you everything. So it's this unit. right here. Let me clear my terminal. Hey, that worked. So I'm just going to run this. This is VS Code, which is the IDE I use. And so beginning, it's going to ask me all these questions. What's my IP? What's my port? Things like that. I have them all saved right here. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy these in. What tag are you using? If you guys remember, before I made those interfaces, I put the capital letters TAG before each number that I wanted it to climb up. That's all my script's asking. And the rest of these are my SSH, my WMI port, and I can paste all those in just like that. Now it's asking me what I want to do. And I mentioned the steps that it does, where it queries the active configuration. So I'm going to do this in order. I'm going to hit 1. And it's going to connect through the API and tell me that my active configuration is September training. And now I'm going to tell it to download. This one's going to take a moment because it would be faster if I use the API directly, but it's actually SSHing to the unit. And it sees that I've already tested this. So it's asking me if I want to regenerate the JSON on the system. I'm going to say no, just to speed this up. And now it's going to download it. So if I go to September training here, I can see that file just got downloaded at 8:30, which must be the time now. Correct. Let me get rid of that. And I can see, there it is. So I'm going to tell it to run through my little regex rule. And I had broken it and had to fix it, which is why all this output is coming out, because I still needed the debugging. Normally it did that silently. But you can see here, it's breaking them all up into a list, and then it's going to delete this part and then add this part and make sure it preserves those time slots. So now it's made this new September training, which I want you guys to take a look at real quick. Oh no, that's wrong. Sorry. Set first. Compare. And here we go. Every time the interface is mentioned through the script, and here we can see that this is LLS DS301 T101. But my clock reference source in my old one was LLS DS301 T1 tag 0. So every orange mark here on the side is one that's been changed. And now what I can do is I can tell this, I must be a 4, to upload that configuration back and then apply it. So you can see that it uploaded the file, closed the SFTP session, and now it's using that tbconfig command to upload it. I could have done this all through the API. I just didn't know how when I made this tool. So while that finishes and applies our new config, which is going to be totally the same, except all of our numbering is fixed, I want to show you guys this one, because this one I made with a little bit more finesse. Let's reveal these in the File Explorer. Close these guys. And I did 2 things here, which I think are very useful to take as an example. One, I have this unit list CSV that's next to it. And 2, I have this configuration.json. And here what I've done is things that I'm assuming everyone who's deploying this gateway would be the same for every single deployment, like DPC length, or whether they're using ITU or things like that, or whether they're using APS. This was only made to configure STM1. I'm asking the users right away how they want to do this. Can I run both at the same time? I think. Nope. All right, let me kill this. Start this one. It doesn't like to end because it's waiting for confirmation that the config is active. And that has to go through the checks and all of that. So what I do here in the very beginning, I'll keep talking while that forces the close, is I ask the user what their STM1 payload type is. And I ask the user whether they're using APS. And it dynamically makes this JSON file based on what the user responds. And then if the script sees that there's already a JSON file, it asks if you want to skip. And then in this unit list, I put the entire script into a while loop. And I say that while there's any line in this CSV, do the whole script over and over and over again. So if I had 20 devices that I needed to modify, I could just change port numbers, passwords. Here are actually time slots of my MTP2 link.
Right.
These are my time slots to my MTP2 link, the first one. And you can see I've got it all described up here, and I'm going to make this available to all you guys. There's nothing so special about my code. I need to keep it secret.
No.
So what it's going to do is take from DS100 on the first time slot. It's going to assign that to the 00M2UA link and give it the link identifier of 20. And then 21 and things like that.
And then the M2UA peer is the destination IP.
And that's
the
that.
port.
Yep. So MTP2 links, M2UA interface ID, and then my M2UA peer. SIGTRAN ports. That doesn't mean the port for M2UA because that's defined in the IP address. It means what physical ports on your device is SIGTRAN going to go out of. SIGTRAN IP, SIGTRAN mask. So you could make this rather quickly and get it ready to go for 20 different things. And my script's going to do it all behind the scenes. Field terminal. So let me delete. I'm sorry. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete this configuration file. And run it. So checking for configuration.json, no configuration file detected. Would you like to make a new one? Yes. And then, like I said, it's asking you all these questions. What's your payload type? Are you using AU3 with VC3 or using AU4 VC4? I made this specifically for a European customer. So
STM1,
I'll say, yeah, it's all STM1, no OC3. Are you going to use APS? Yes. What's your SCTP port? And this was something I stole from our engineers. If you see a default like that, you can always just hit enter and it'll take the default. And remember, we were talking about whether when you communicate with the Metaswitch over M2UA, if the interface ID type needs to be string or integer. I'm asking that question here. What's your DPC format? I probably didn't need to ask that. What's your MTP2 protocol type? So this is actually going to make my JSON config file. I don't know why I didn't find that unit list. And it can't connect to the unit that I had it set up for on my unit list.
Yeah, but I think it's okay. Was the configuration file created or?
This one doesn't create a configuration file. It does everything one by one. I'm not sure why it can't connect to my TG though.
Well, it's okay for now. I think we covered pretty much, and there's some instructions, right, with your script there.
Yes.
It
tells you a little bit here, and then also as it makes this CSV, it gives you more instructions on how to make this correct, the formatting.
Okay, very good. And this is work in progress, right? So we are improving this to make it more usable. And so we will have updates on these files.
And we'll make one targeted focus towards
Metaswitch and such.
Metaswitch
Correct.
and North American customers.
Correct.
All
Okay.
right.
Very good.
Have any customers used Ansible or something akin to write playbooks to support initial configurations? I don't know Ansible.
I don't know either. I've never heard of this. So I don't think our customers are using it.
Or they're using it without help.
Yeah, exactly. Which is great.
Yep.
Okay. So I wanted to show, so we're done with this here. There's two other things I wanted to show here in the systems. You remember we talked about the applications running on the CentOS Linux host. So there's two additional things we can do here. If you click on host here, and then you click on status, you get to the unit. You could have two. I'm here on the test generator, but you could have two here. And then you get information on the host. We saw this, we showed this already the previous trainings, but we didn't talk about this one here, host control action, right? So you can open this drop-down box and you can do things on the server. So these are things we don't do very often, and that's why it's so deep into the configuration or the status even. If you want to reboot the CentOS host, you can do this here. If you want to shut down completely the unit, so shutdown will shut down the CentOS host, but also the telecom unit. So let's say you want to move this unit to another location, maybe you want to completely shut it down. So normally you don't want to do this here. We here reset host role. So if this system is in a standalone, but if you want later to add a +1 unit, you may want to put it in a 1+1 role. So then you need to go here, reset host role. Then you can choose, now I want to be a primary of a system or a secondary of a system. And the last one I want to show here is upgrade Linux packages. So here, if you click on this and you do apply action, it will search on our repository here, right? So it's going to check the repo data from the system here, and we'll try to find it. Okay, so maybe we didn't configure here. The only thing that can happen is if we didn't configure the DNS of the unit. So maybe I can check on the primary unit. The other way to do this is yum update. If you do yum update, you'll find this. Yeah, so we're missing our DNS here, so we can't update. Let me check on another system that we have. This one here, yum update. If the DNS is working, it's gonna find the data here and then look if there was any updates to be done. Here I did it yesterday, so it's already updated. Otherwise, it's going to ask you, do you want to update all the files and do this? So normally we don't need to update the CentOS software. And you see here, it has not been updated since it was installed probably almost a year ago here. And it still works, right? So sometimes, rarely, when you upgrade a system to a new version, it will ask you to update those packages, or you can update them if you want to make sure you have the latest security updates on the CentOS kernel. Then I want to show the TB support. TB support here. Just a few things on this. So you can reach our technical support. Like we mentioned initially, we have people different places, Turkey, Colombia, Vietnam, here in Montreal, so you can reach us. This is the Montreal office number. However, to reach us at any time, if you didn't have contact with us before, you can always use the 24/7 number. This will find someone available at any time, day or night or weekends, to reach us. Okay. Well, a lot of times we work like this with Zoom, Teams, or any sharing, any desk also. software, and you can then chat with our team and talk with our team here. Okay, so you can just exchange our information to be able to help you. Of course, the emails is something that we use a lot. So if you have any questions, you want to have help at a specific time, you can just send to the support team. We will all receive this information, and we will assign it to someone in our team to help or follow up on this information. On our wiki, docs.telcobridges.com, you have this information about technical support. When we sell those devices, we have two choices of support here. One is a 24/7 support. And then if you use this, if you get this on the device, you can reach our support team at any time for troubleshooting. So again, you use the 24/7 number. It's going to find one of our support engineer available, and we'll be able to help you on these. Or you can just have the 9 to 5 SLA if you don't need to have weekends or other types of support here. And then you can reach us at any time, daytime. But since we have people all around the world, our daytime is pretty long. If everybody is there, we'll be able to answer about any time in the day. These also include warranties on the devices, or if there's ever a problem on one of the devices, we can ship you a new one, and then you return the one that is non-functioning back to us. We have also possibility to buy 9 to 5 professional services. So if you need help for any configuration, specific configuration, changes in the system, if you want us to do your RESTful API tool to install your system, so we can get the professional services ours. We also offer trainings, additional training. So we have this training we gave now, but we can go and help you either install or give more training as you need. Other resources that we have, the wiki, we talked a lot about that. We didn't show it that much in this training, but it's all the latest information is on the wiki. We update it almost daily with new information. You can see which versions have which features added into the versions, right? So you have this here. We have the forums here, the TelcoBridges forums. So here you may want to ask access to this. There's some questions that are being asked there, and also the latest versions are shown here as well. If you get the 9 to 5 professional services, it's per hour that we sell those professional services, so you can have access to our time tracking system. We have also our TB support tracking system where we log all the problems that we encounter, the cases that are open. So you can have access to this as well if you want. So you can just ask us to give you access to this support tracking system. It has direct access to all the support team, and the engineering team has access to this system as well. Access to licenses. So if you want to change the licenses on the system, so for example, you have 2 MTP2 links and you want to increase that to 4 MTP2 links, then we will create a new license, and you can go on the dashboard to get this license downloaded. So you have you can have your account on the dashboard and download these licenses. And then the software download links. So that's if you need to upgrade the system. So it will be like this. We now host it on Amazon S3. So you can see the version here, and you download that file. It's called TB Toolpack with the version name. And then you can just upload it on the system to activate the new configuration. So then we can help you, like I mentioned, with any desk, Teams, or Zoom, or direct SSH access. Sometimes we open a VPN if we need to connect very often. We can open a VPN with the customer site to better control of the system. But whatever is useful for you is what can be used on our side.